Hi everyone. So this week there are two major topics we're going to address. And I've kind of put them broadly under evolutionary and archaeological perspectives, but really what we're looking at is, as I said, two broad themes, two major things. And the first is, and this is why I have assigned the chapter by Zuck from the textbook for you, is looking at how or where do these ideas we have about gender roles or sex roles, where do these ideas come from? So why do we have these ideas that men are, or males of our species are inherently stronger or faster than females of our species? Where do we have idea that females of our species are more nurturing or motherly, right, more caring than males of our species? So where do these ideas come from? So those ideas, we're going to look at Zuck, and we're going to look at Zuck's critiques of some of the animal models and how they've been applied to understanding sex roles and gender roles in humans and some of the challenges of that. And then the second question is also building along the lines of how these kind of stereotypes we have around the roles and behaviors of members of the opposite sexes or the opposite genders, of course, in a heteronormative framework, but how these stereotypes we have influence the kind of narratives we tell about the past. And then the last kind of piece of that is that I've then introduced the topic of sexuality very briefly, and not really even sexuality so much as just examples of sex, the act, in the archaeological record as an example for us to talk more about cultural relativism, ethnocentrism, and also kind of deterministic interpretation. So a bunch of different topics I'm kind of amalgamating into this idea of kind of gender and the past more broadly, right? So briefly then, we're going to look at this idea or this question of what is the role then of biology in human behavior. So again, this is the critique of Zuck. And then we're going to look at how our understanding of gender, age, and sex today influence how we interpret the archaeological records. So again, this idea of both of these topics are dealing with how we construct interpretive models and what sort of evidence and data do we use to support those models and then come up with interpretations. Okay, so briefly, I want you to also remember this idea or this dichotomy that I introduced to you last topic relating to nature versus nurture, right? And so part of the reason why the Zuck reading is so important is that it's going to challenge this idea that our behaviors and our roles are always explicitly the result of our biology, right? Saying that it's not quite as simple as that. That nurture, or more broadly culture, influences the roles and the characteristics that we assign to various members of the sexes or of the genders as well. And so the reason for this, as I mentioned, is that we often equate this idea of natural with biology, but also this idea of biology as being something that is fixed and static, right? So again, this idea that you are born a particular sex, you're assigned this sex at birth, you're then assigned a gender at birth, and then that these then are kind of rigidly adhered to and fixed, and that the kind of traits or characteristics that you express as a member of a sex reflect, again, this biological makeup that you have. So it kind of drives your motivations, etc., right? Okay. Before we get into that, I provide a little bit of background relating to human evolution. The reason for this is to kind of first illustrate the depth at which we are kind of approaching this idea from anthropology of what it does mean to be human. We're looking at an archaeological or paleoanthropological record that goes back at least 6 million years ago for our earliest ancestors. But clearly those ancestors don't look the same as us today. They've changed over time, both in terms of their anatomy and presumably in terms of behavior. And we see some evidence for this in terms of culture and change in stone tool technologies in particular over these millennia, right, over these millions of years. So one of the challenges we sometimes have is looking at this archaeological and paleoanthropological record and then interpreting what the behaviors were like. And the reason why we want to interpret the behaviors of these hominins, of these human ancestors, is because of how it's influenced who we are today, right? Again, when did things like, women are responsible for childcare, when did that develop and result? Is that purely just because it is biological females who are giving birth to, or I should say individuals' uteruses who are giving birth to offspring, right? So where did these ideas come about, etc.? We'll look at the fossil record. And one of the key things that comes from looking not just at the fossil record, but if we look more broadly at primates, and humans are one of the various kinds of primates, both in the past and also in terms of living primates, is that one of the explanations for why we have differentiation in sex roles between male and female is because of sexual dimorphism, right? That we have, these anatomical characteristics that we use to distinguish and separate members of the sex. And these are very pronounced in all non-human primates, right? The degree to which they're pronounced varies a bit, but there is definitely a difference between males and females. And so in the fossil record, what we see is that significant changes in the male and female pelvis happened about 2 million years ago in modern humans, but we can see sexual dimorphism in other primates. And so I've given you some examples here showing where we have males on average being significantly larger, such as in our orangs here, our gorillas, and these are baboons, Hamadryas baboons, I believe, where the male is significantly larger than the female on average, right? So why is there the significant difference in terms of males of the species versus females of the species? And perhaps if we can figure that out for living primates, we can figure it out then why it existed in our earliest ancestors, and then why do these differences continue in human populations today? Okay. Then basically the first half of this PowerPoint deals with the Zuck reading. So I provide a kind of summary of some of the key arguments that Zuck makes, and then cite some of the authors that Zuck uses to support the positions that she comes up with. So the animal models that she focuses on and relate to sexual selection, to male dominance and biological aggression, to maternal instinct, and this is a really interesting one. I want to talk a little bit more in Blackboard Collaborate this week, as some of the kind of really scary, problematic, ethical, but clearly important primate isolation or deprivation experiments that have shown that basically the maternal instinct is not as strongly biologically linked as we might think it might be. So we'll look at that, particularly in terms of the inevitability of the mother-infant attachment and how motherhood is kind of socially constructed, even in primates, and socially learned. Also mate fidelity, where I introduce some new terminology relating to monogamy versus other relationship structures. Okay. And then some of the critiques of some of the models, and I want to talk a little bit about this in Collaborate as well, looking at these definitions of strength and how they influence sometimes the sex roles that we assign to individuals. Okay. And then after that, after you've looked at Zuck, then we're going to swap into looking at the archaeology of gender. I note that I teach an entire course on this, so this is meant to be a very brief introduction to some of the topics, but two of the things that I focused on here are first and foremost visibility, or addressing invisibility in representation in the profession, but then also looking at some of the traditional androcentric models that exist and how these kind of supported by these early biological animal-derived models. So, for example, man the hunter versus woman the gatherer. So, and that's what the second half of this course, or this PowerPoint looks at, or this topic looks at, is how, again, our kind of understanding of gender and of sex in the present influences our interpretation of those in the past. So I've given you an example of the warrior grave BJ 581 and how understandings of who could be a warrior in the present influenced our interpretation of this particular burial. I've given some information about to highlight the significance of the contribution of female archaeologists, because often in textbooks we see kind of narratives that present the development of any discipline from a very kind of androcentric or male-focused perspective, right? So you hear about all these great men who contributed to the development of the discipline. And archaeology is a case where many narratives of the development of our discipline have focused on this, but we clearly have a significant number, and I've just selected a handful here, but a significant number of women who have contributed significantly to how archaeology is done today. And then I've provided a little bit of information about how one of the things that's really interesting when we start to look at the contribution of female archaeologists is we see just how integrated and networked they are with each other, that we have these systems and communities of collaboration. That is really something important. So then I go on to explain a little bit about these models, these androcentric stories of human evolution that are also very kind of racist as well, because they always focus on the point of view of white males and how these kind of shaped our early interpretations of the archaeological record. This then had a counterpoint in the 70s with women the gatherer models, but how these are also kind of problematic because they're not intersectional, as well as they're very, again, deterministic. The idea that your kind of sex determines the roles that you can then perform in a society. And so we're going to be critiquing these arguments later on when we talk about household structures and subsistence practices, etc., later on in the term. Okay, so then I talk a little bit about the critique, some of the approaches that are taken, some new terminology for you, and then we get into the Adavasio et al. Reading, The Fashioning of Women, that talks about one of my favorite things, the Pavlovian, Kostenkian, Graveckian PKG statuettes, also called the Venus figurines. And so I've given you some illustrations that kind of highlight some of the arguments that are presented in this reading. Okay. Then I've also talked a little bit about Joyce's reading, which brings together all of these topics. Now, this is an optional reading. You don't have to read it. You can just honestly look at the summary I've provided here. But Joyce basically brings together some of the arguments made in Zuck, some of the points that are made in Adavasio et al., and again looks at how biology and gender have influenced our interpretation of the past. Then I go on to talk a little bit about, without defining sexuality, about how sexuality and sexual activity have been inferred and interpreted from the archaeological record. And so I give you some examples of material culture that has been explicitly linked by archaeologists to sexuality because of basically what they're representing. So for example, here are some antler and ivory phalluses that have been excavated from Upper Paleolithic sites throughout Europe. I believe most of these are from French sites. And the idea is that, oh, well, because they look like phalluses or because they look like penises, then potentially they're linked with sexual behavior and activity. But what further analyses have shown for this bottom one in particular is that this is actually a spear thrower. So it has nothing to do with sex and sexual activity, but is part of hunting practices, right? So why have we sexualized particular parts of human anatomy? And so penises are one, or phalluses are one that are heavily sexualized. And so one of the questions I have is why? Well, it's because they're sexualized in the present. So we infer, interpret, or assume that they must have been sexualized in the past as well. So I give you some other examples. Again, phalluses in the archaeological record. This one is one that interests me a lot because it shows how sometimes our interpretation of something as phallic is really shaped by the cultural lens that we project. And so you see the kind of carving on the bottom here, a photograph on the black to kind of highlight the etching on this piece of bone. And then this is a hand drawing that's meant to illustrate the point. What's argued is that there is this cave bear. So we can clearly see this cave bear, right? Because we see its little eye here, see its nose here, its mouth, its ear, right? So here's a little cave bear here. So I think most of us can agree that that looks like a very reasonable representation of a cave bear. So where's the phallus, they say? Well, they argue that what is represented here is a phallus. So this is the head of the penis, the shaft. We have two testes on either side, right? So this represents kind of the scrotal region here. This is the perianal region, and then this is the anus here, right? So at least that's one of the interpretations of this. Other archaeologists, however, have said, well, that might actually be a bit of a stretch, that maybe someone is reading into this carving that dates, you can see, to 17,000 years ago. they're maybe reading something into this more than was actually intended, right? So we have to think about, again, how our own cultural lenses, how we sexualize particular aspects of human bodies, how this then influences our reading of objects from the archaeological record. And the same goes with some of these examples here. So this is a carving of Le Sorcier, or the sorcerer. So you can see his head, his arms, his back, and then he's interpreted to be male because there are 2 legs and then a penis here. And it's argued that he's a sorcerer because in his hand he's holding some sort of stick with some sort of attachment at the bottom. This is called the Priapus. I mentioned this below, after a Greek symbol of fertility. And so this has been argued to be a carving where we have the face of the individual here, their arm, and then you can see again a penis-like or phallus-like shape with testicles there. Right? But again, how much are we reading into this this carving? Is this actually what was represented? Here are some examples from a more recent part of the archaeological record. That here is an actual image of Priapus here. You can see characterized by this enlarged phallus. But we also see phalluses decorating other aspects of Pompeii. Wind chimes that definitely would not be Edmonton Homeowner Association approved. These were kind of meant to ward off evil. They were kind of like a good luck protective charm or amulet around the household. Same with what we see in this image here. At the erotic brothels and bathhouses in Pompeii, and also at the site of Herculaneum, we do see representations now of actual sexualized acts, right? And I'd argue here is where it is reasonable to interpret sexuality, right? Just because a penis is present, as we saw with the wind chime on the earlier thing, doesn't mean it's explicitly linked with sexuality or with fertility or any of these other notions. But these images here are clear representations of sexuality. And just to note that this little penis here on this paving stone, these pointed in directions, they're like arrows to the brothels, and bathhouses in Pompeii and Herculaneum. If we step outside of a European context, we also see representations of sexuality with the moche so-called porno pots or erotic pottery. But below, I've provided you with some alternative interpretations of this, that even though we might see an explicit sexual act represented, that doesn't mean inherently that it is capturing or representing sexuality per se. That Rosemary Joyce talks about how these might simply represent different various power dynamics, that most of the sexual acts that are represented here are not associated with reproduction either. So these were not educational or teaching tools, but these might have represented power dynamic that existed between the ruling class and the lower class, right? Those who perform sexual acts versus those who receive it. That it's not about the sex per se, but again, the power dynamic that's represented. Then I go into a very explicit example of gender and archaeology, and using a contextual example of a so-called goddess figurine and what they actually might represent. When we consider not just the carving itself of a female figure, it might not even be a female figure, which I talk about in the notes, but when we talk about where it's found and what we know about behavior in the culture of the area, then it might tell us actually something more and give us some really lovely nuanced interpretations versus simply like, oh, because it has large breasts and a large belly, it's a pregnant female body. So that's a big example here. And I provide a lot of context around art, etc., at the site. And then with some recent work that's been done that illustrates and explains these things. And then I have a couple of kind of joke slides that aren't a joke in terms of the content, but in terms of how they're represented, about how also a heteronormative bias influences our interpretation of archaeological sites. So how if you find 2 female skeletons, such as an example of this, buried together, initially they might be constructed of as lovers until it's revealed that they're female. Then they're often said as just, a couple of gals being pals, etc. So that how non-heteronormative sexualities are often erased in these interpretations we have regarding the archaeological record. Then the last part I bring in here finally is just a little note about about age, because remember that's one of our other major themes of this course, talking about archaeology of children and childhood, that it's not only how other identities and genders are misrepresented or underrepresented in archaeological interpretations, but we've done a really poor job of capturing children and childhood in our interpretations of the past. Okay, so that's what I had for this topic this week. I apologize for the slightly longer video, and I look forward to talking about the readings explicitly in the discussion questions with you in our Blackboard Collaborate session this week.